what I want to cover is How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. So this, what I tell my audience is this is a foundational work. This is probably the best book I've ever read. I haven't just read it once, I've read it 8 times, and I've rewritten it longhand in pen 6 times. That's how juicy this book is. So what I tell my audience is, like, if you want to understand yourself better, your spouse better, your kids better, your employees better, and most of all, your customers better, you got to read this book. So, and I don't know about you, Mike, but when I listen to Steven Pinker speak or read what he writes, he is gorgeously articulate. So probably the most articulate man I've ever heard. And the only downside with reading his material is he's kind of accidentally showing off in every paragraph. So he's a Harvard linguist. So the way I recommend it is, if you're going to buy the book, I want you to buy it on Kindle. It's this way you can touch all the words you won't recognize, because there's going to be a lot, but you will expand your vocabulary. So what were your thoughts?
There's nothing common about common sense. That's one of the first things that stands out to me. And I haven't read it 8 times. I've read it once. I've had to go back and reread a lot of what I've highlighted. But I found, although it's sometimes, admittedly, it's really difficult because you've got to dig into what he is saying. And sometimes I find that the YouTube material that exists out there supplements what it is.
Well said.
Because sometimes, I mean, it depends on how you learn, right? An individual can read and automatically grab all the information, or if you're like me, you want to hear it in addition to reading it. So that's what I have done. I've read it, then gone back and listened to, and it's not a YouTube channel. It's just, he has been filmed in different settings and forums, etc., talking about some of his other works. And I find him fascinating, especially for what I do for a living, and understanding why it is that we think the way that we think and act the way that we act.
Well said. So I see it as a foundational work. So I know he's done 5 Joe Rogans. It's a great way to get introduced to him. He's done a handful of others too. Like my favorite podcast is the Michael Shermer Show. And I know I'm unusual. I'm a weirdo. I would like to hear 2 PhDs have a conversation, because they're the only profession that can't lie to us. So they can't even lie to us accidentally. So they could be defenestrated, lose their PhD, and that's part of their identity. So they go to lengths. So really the downside of going down the rabbit hole with a Steven Pinker or even Michael Shermer is they take forever to make a decision. So, but the beauty of it is especially when they're in long form talk communications, like on YouTube, they like being a PhD is like being a hyper expert in a field no one gives a rat's ass about. So in order for someone to build a cohesive argument, they have to cite all these other PhDs. So he turned me on to Roy Baumeister and Paul Slovak and Tubian Kosmides and Jonathan Haidt, and on and on and on and on and on. It becomes this awesome spider web of objective truth, so we can understand why people do what they do. And there's some key takeaways from this book. I'm kind of curious about what yours were.
There are too many to name in like a 10-second soundbite. I just can tell you, more than anything, my key takeaway is you have to understand how the mind works to be successful in a personal relationship or a professional setting. Or at least you have to have some idea of how it works. You don't necessarily need to have read Pinker 8 times, but you have to have an idea of how it is that the psychology of individuals, especially when it comes to politics, which of course, I try to bring everything back to what I do, which is in media, politics, public opinion. And a couple of the things stood out to me. And it was actually, again, using YouTube to supplant what I read here. And it was in a 2008 discussion he gave. It wasn't a TED Talk, but it was a discussion. And he said, he spoke about political rhetoric and how it is that the mind impacts that. And I wrote it down. That's why I'm looking down. I'm not trying to avoid eye contact here. But anything that a politician says in terms of policy is bound to upset some sector of the population. By the population, I'm using the U.S. model, the U.S. population. That's why politicians are deliberately vague. They're windier in their comments. They're faker. Uh, and then he goes on to say gaffes, which is obviously when we believe a politician, elected official has said something they shouldn't say and could hurt them, their candidacy, or themselves in office. Gaffes, according to Pickner, are when politicians tell the truth. And so
Yeah,
that's
well
the
said.
political side. But the media side of it, which stands out to me because again, I'm thinking in what I mostly do for a living, is that media hurts when it comes to their coverage. It hurts and makes this problem worse because they aren't necessarily looking for the concrete. They're
Yes.
not necessarily saying, I am not going to raise taxes at all or something definitive. We talk about taxes a lot. So let me just say that, I'm not raising taxes. That's a campaign pledge. Okay. But they're kind of vague because, in a way, you go into some kind of negotiation, legislative negotiation, and then lo and behold, it's the old George H.W. Bush, read my lips, no new taxes. Well, he had
Yeah.
to eventually because
Yeah.
he had to compromise. So
Hmm.
I think that's a one of those moments where you realize they're not very concrete. The media then is looking for them to have gas.
Yeah.
And basically that's where they've that has led to, according to Pinkler, and I kind of agree with him, tend to agree with him, turning words like liberal and conservative into swear words in the United States, whereas he uses the example in other countries, Canada, there's a liberal party.
Yeah.
It's different in different countries, but yes, I could see based on what he wrote here how that seeps into our language, our attitudes, how we elect our leaders, how we hold them accountable or give them passes in a lot of circumstances, and really how the press covers it. How do they make the problem worse, or is there something they could do to make it better?
Yeah, I'd say some of the takeaways for me was like more in the practical sense. Like there's one concept he brought up that is a causal factor in the differences between males and females. So what he talked about, he was having in effect, a literary argument with a feminist, and she was arguing that there is no male oral contraceptive, no way to suppress males' fertility orally, because it's a male conspiracy to hold down women and hold back women by giving them cancer because of the contraceptives that they have to take. And what his argument back was like, no, 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 this is a question of volume. She didn't quite understand. And he brought up the biology behind it, that a woman is born with approximately 1 million eggs and will only have 400 menstrual cycles her entire lifetime. So she has very limited opportunity to get pregnant. But then the investment that she has to put into it physically is so vast. That's what causes the some of the perception differences between males and females. One adult male, makes enough sperm in 1 hour to impregnate every impregnatable woman on planet Earth. So that
Don't tell too many men that, though.
well, so what happens is that blew me away. So what that means is you and I are superfluous. So that's the reason why society doesn't really care all that much about men. Like there's something like 9,000 governmental agencies to help women. There's 9 to help men. So, and homeless men are something to be avoided. Homeless women are something to be cared for. So there's a different calculus whenever we're adopting public policy, or even within our businesses, even how they buy things. Like 95% of all cars are car collectors are male. 95% of shoe collectors are female. So, but it comes from this one concept that starts to steer things differently. Another one that blew me away. You remember the one about pregnancy sickness and how Freud was convinced that that was the woman's subconscious mind trying to abort the fetus orally. Like he had a lot of wacky ideas, right? Well, it turns out that during that stage of pregnancy, the fetus is still forming organs, and that foods could be harmful, even cause death in utero. So so what the woman does is evolves a hypersensitive smell detector in case she's going to ingest anything that could be potentially toxic to that fetus. So like, man, just the evolution. of us is stunning when you get into the weeds on it. However, it's an equal opportunity offender. You know what I mean? Because I know it does piss off a lot of feminists when I bring stuff like that up in my live shows.
But even see, it's in the early pages of what Pinkner put together. Um, and he's actually going into his using evolutionary theory a lot of why we are how we are. But when he breaks it down, and you could read when you read him, you could tell he's a linguist because it's art the way that he
Yeah.
explains it. But I
Yeah.
had here highlighted on 19: sight and action and common sense and violence and morality and love are no accident, no inextricable ingredients of an intelligent essence, no inevitability of information processing. Each is a tour de force wrought by a high level of targeted design. Hidden behind the panels of consciousness must lie fantastically complex machinery, optical analyzers, motion guided systems, simulations of the world, databases on people and things. Politicians have those. Goals, schedulers, conflict resolvers, and many more. I mean, it's the complexity of evolution.
It's fascinating. So he actually did a debate with a female. I think she was a psychologist at Harvard, and so he's a linguist at Harvard, and they were debating whether the minds really are different or not. This was back in the early 2000s. I just caught one on YouTube about it, and one of the fascinating things is this doesn't really bode well for dudes. So at 8 weeks of gestation, the fetus that will become male is masculinized. We're bombarded with testosterone, which kills off sections of our memory and emotion. Because the thing in our ancestral past, the very thing that's going to hunt down the mastodon and kill it to feed the village, you don't want it having a good memory because then it won't do that. You don't want to have it like in touch with its feelings because then it won't do that. It's got to kill Bambi's mother, right? So the idea is that he brings up the fact that 100% of the Darwin Awards were the recipients were male. So this goes back all the way to the 90s. So let me describe what the Darwin Awards for those few of you who aren't familiar. When the internet was first formed in the early 90s, only scientists were on it. So this is before all of us could get onto it later in the 90s. And they created something called the Darwin Awards, which is where the scientists vote on whoever in the United States died the most sublimely idiotic way. Like so dumb that it benefits the rest of the species because we don't have to deal with their progeny. They didn't get to procreate or aren't going to procreate anymore because they're so dumb. So the 100% of the Darwin Award recipients are male. So this is, and when I tell my female audiences, even the rare feminist that's in my audience that gets upset by this, I'm like, did you ever just look around at the population of dudes, ladies, and sit back and go, really? Like this is the best we got? And invariably they'll all sit there, they'll quietly shake their head yes, and some will actually scream like every day, Mark. So we're not supposed to be all that smart. We're supposed to be superfluous. We're supposed to be able to lay down our lives in protection of and provision of the next generation, right? But it does create a cascade of behavior differences that are absolutely phenomenal. Just so cool when you're unoffendable, you're open to truth.
Yeah, but the problem there, my friend, is that with each passing hour, I think at least U.S. society gets more and more offendable.
Yep.
Not the entire society, obviously, because we're all different. And I hate when they even group this down to one political party or one generation or whatever. I just think that regardless what your background is, or if you're even into politics or into watching traditional press and news reports or not, whatever it may be, there's this level of offended population out there where almost, and it happens often in college classrooms. I haven't, thankfully, in my 5.5 years of being in a college classroom, I haven't had this be the issue, but I know it exists. And it's okay. Well, if you aren't unoffendable, are you open to whether it's truth or whether it's the ability to succeed, whatever your definition of success is? But it could be in relationships, it could be in a profession, it could be running a business, whatever it may be. I mean, that's the truth. And I think Pinker and folks like him, not that there's an equal to him, but folks like him who, especially you, that you have I'm sure you have a cap or a t-shirt somewhere that says I love PhDs. or something along those lines. There are folks that study the mind and then take that information and paint a portrait of why we are how we are. And I'm sure there's somewhere in here, or maybe it's an updated book that he could write on why it is that we see this segment of our society that is increasingly offended by everything. There may be one day when a segment of the population is offended by sunlight. I don't know, but it just, to me, we have to figure that part out if we're going to have a functioning federal republic, if we're going to continue to have governments that try to do what's best for its residents and the citizens of this country and others. So that would be an area where I would dive into. If you have any recommendations, I'd love to
He,
hear them.
well, he did. So but not in this book. All right, he didn't cover it in this book. He covered it in a conversation he had with Sam Harris. Right, again, two PhDs having a conversation. They're going to get to truth. They outlined a concept called blue lies. So he talks about it not as blue lies. That's the catchy phrase for it now. He talks about how people have cherished beliefs. And what those beliefs are really about is not about truth. It's about showing which side you're on. So what happens is people wake up offended because it's another way to look at it is called conspicuous outrage. Like, a friend of mine bought an Aston Martin, and I was reading Pinker, like sitting at a Starbucks right here in town, and he was showing me his Aston Martin. I said, "You know why you bought that?" And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's a conspicuous show that's honest, that very few other males could replicate." So you probably didn't know this consciously, but subconsciously, what you're trying to do is to project to the world your phenotypic quality, how much fitness you have. You have so much excess fitness, you could actually afford that car, which very few people could. Because I
You
think
have
it
a
was like,
bigger bank account, in other words.
yeah. So what that does is that actually comes from sexual selection, like blue lies do. So what blue lies are, they're called blue lies because the New York City Police Department in the 70s would lie on behalf of each other, thinking that showed how ethical they are, when in actuality it was the opposite. So it's a lie, like so if it's a white lie, like you tell me I look good in this shirt because you're my buddy, right? When I don't. A white lie is a lie you tell to someone else to have them feel better about themselves. A blue lie is a lie told to a coalition to prove loyalty to that coalition. So what people are offended by is showing which side they're on. Then,
But
sure, go
what's
ahead.
interesting is you could say that blue lies extend to political movements and political
Without a doubt,
parties.
100%.
Aha.
That's the reason why people have giant Trump flags off the back of their cars. It's not about truth. That's what QAnon is. It's not about truth. It's about showing which side you're on. So my argument is, what I tell my audience is that politics makes us stupid. What we got to do is recognize, can we stay in investigation mode a little longer than we normally would? Steven Pinker started me on that path 15 years ago when I read that book for the first time.
So
He
when
also
he
turned me into an
says,
anthropologist.
so when you jump into, I don't know, you have way too many hats and you're way too smart for me. But when you jump in, again, going through my notes here, if you're going to page 42, and I'm sticking to the early portion of it,
Yeah.
what would you say? So it says here, he writes down, our minds are designed to generate behavior that would have been adaptive. So I understand what you're saying when it comes to political movements. But he says behavior is the outcome of an internal struggle among many mental
Yep.
modules, and it is played out on the chessboard of opportunities and constraints defined by other people's behavior. And of course, this is all based on the fact that we don't think of it this way, but 99% of human existence, we were hunters and gatherers. Was a
Exactly.
very different era. But how do you square that then? Because are you basically
Okay.
saying political movements follow the leader based on what they perceive to be popular enough that they should adapt to it?
There's a whole slew of things there. Okay, so this comes from, what I want to do with this podcast is eventually interview people like Steven Pinker, so we can interview him. Now we got to get to a certain size of subscribers in order to warrant them to come on. So it's probably going to be this first year where we're going over these books this way, but we can actually create a vector of truth. So what happens? You have the theories that Pinker's outlining, which most aren't his theories. So that's basically, this book is a meta-analysis. So my guess is right around 600 or so PhDs theses. So but how we get to the vector of truth is sometimes another PhD's theory coincides with another one's, right? So in this case, we're talking about William von Hippel. So he wrote the book The Social Ape, I believe. I think that's the title. So what his concept is that when we climbed out of the trees in the savannas of East Africa, we went from an apex position to a beta position. We were now lion lunch. Yet our physiology changed. We were able to stand up. So that meant our arms became arms. Like if you get into the wingspan of a chimpanzee, you're losing that fight. A chimpanzee is 5 times stronger than the strongest adult male. Literally can rip your arms off, tie you up into knots, right? Because their arms are really legs. It's meant for climbing. So yet, if you're outside of the arm reach of a chimpanzee, it can't do much to you. It'll scare the hell out of you, but it can't kill you. It can't deal death from far away. So it's a combination of things. Once we could stand and start throwing stones, well, one early human or proto-human called a hominid throwing stones at a lion, it's the lion's lunch. 50 humans getting together throwing stones at the lion's lunch. So what happens is as soon as we start to collaborate, start to communicate, we are the most collaborative species on the planet. We are the only species where non-relatives will work together, and all you got to do is walk over to a construction site. You'll see hundreds of non-relatives all working together in unison. Only human beings are capable of doing that. But that means we have to evolve language so that we could share commodities yet retain them. It's called information. So we became, in Pinker's verbiage, informivores. We want to know about each other. Like one lie that you hear is women gossip and men don't. No. Men gossip too. We just gossip about different things. So what we do is we share information, some good, some bad, while we're trying to navigate our status within our in-group. And one of the things that lets us do that are blue lies. It's I'm telling you that I'm your ally. I'm not telling you that I believe truth. And here's the really pernicious thing politically. The wackier the lie, the wackier the belief, the more loyalty is produced in that belief. So it's
Well,
always
we're definitely seeing that nowadays, and that's part of
totally.
the challenge. Is whether it's in a political movement or even within a C-suite of a major company. I mean, if you believe your own, if you tell lies and you believe your own lies, then your market share will shrink. If you're seen as a dishonest CEO, eventually that runs its course, and probably if it's a board of directors or someone else will eventually move you out. So I mean, that's the danger. I would call that the danger of groupthink, though.
Yeah.
That's just something that I created. I do not have a PhD. I have a nice master's degree, but definitely not in this. And so I would say the dangers of groupthink can be, again, thinking the way that through what my lenses are because of what I do for a living. I would say that's part of a presentation. Actually, thanks for helping me. I'm going to edit some of my presentations that I do for C-suite clients, because yes, the dangers of groupthink and the way that you put out press statements, for example, if there's an inquiry because there was an incident with your company, et cetera, et cetera. So I I see the value, even if you're not Mark Prott and love PhDs and love reading research papers and can name, probably right now, if I told you name 10 PhDs in 20 seconds, I bet you could do that right now. Even if you're not you, it's important to understand from or learn from the PhDs, especially anything related to the mind and our human behavior.
Yeah. And there's one other thing I want to talk about. He covers something in there that's great, and I want to make sure that we cover it. It's the argument about are we alone? So because we're egotistical about assuming that we are the pinnacle of evolution. So and yet intelligence is only one strategy. So he brings up an argument about how the average brown trout has an IQ of 4. The average man has an IQ of 100. Have you ever watched the average man try to catch the average brown trout? That's like take that evolution.
Yeah,
So that's one
yeah.
thing. The second thing is like, and this is a debate that I've had with my family. They want to say that there has to be intelligent life on other planets because there are so many. That's the mathematician's argument. So what he brings up
Well,
is
and
that
galaxies and all that. Yeah, I
yeah,
understand that argument.
yeah, sure. And it's easy to do it. It's easy to look at it that way, except when you actually look at it how life actually evolved on planet Earth. And one of the first things is the giant impact hypothesis, where now I heard it this way. Originally, it was called uh, like an ejected planet from another solar system. So the moon hit us at such an angle that if it was a stronger angle, it would have destroyed both celestial bodies. If it hit us at a shallower angle, it never would have tilted us on our axis, set us spinning, which creates the seasons. So therefore, we would have wildly uncontrollable weather patterns where life could not actually evolve on. So the likelihood of that happening to another planet in another solar system is so remote, it's not worth it to publicly fund the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And to this day, it's still funded privately.
Well, and
So
you get into the fact that we just got into interstellar space with Voyagers. I think both of them are in interstellar space, and a solar system, another solar system making contact there. I mean, the numbers are minuscule, but NASA needs something to do. I mean, they do good work within our solar system, and certainly studying what we do here, especially now with increasing missions to the moon by other countries. So I understand that, but yeah, I've heard that from you before, but also from others. It's if there is life on other planets, whether it's in this solar system or not. It correct me if I'm wrong. It's more than likely bacteria. It's some other form of life, not Luke Skywalker goes from one planet, which is mostly human in Tatooine. Yes, I love Star Wars, to another planet in another solar system that also has humans. In other words,
yeah,
it would be a completely different life form. So I agree with that, and I understand I understand when folks look at it and say, there has to be life elsewhere, and I can certainly appreciate that. But what I would say is we have so many issues here on planet Earth, and just within you mentioned we're the most cooperative. Yes, we are the most cooperative, but one of the challenges that I see is that within that cooperation is, and I'm honestly just bringing this up right now in my mind, within that cooperation is to exclude others who aren't like us. So yes, non-relatives cooperate, but the exclusion of folks who are not like us. And that
yeah,
I'm not really in the US, I'm not really as concerned racially, although we certainly have racial issues. But I mean, again, thinking back to the political and also to the media, and what we consume, our the media we consume, the reporting we consume, comes down to are they like us, are they not? Just like the political movements, are you like us, are you not? When there's a lot of complexity to that, especially in U.S. politics, where you live is a major component of how you view taxation, how you view public investments, how you view industries. If your state, if you, in particular Florida, tourism, let me tell you, um, we live mostly off of visitors coming here or purchasing second properties or retiring and coming down here. So there are different ways, but I look at to your point, most cooperative, yes, we cooperate often to exclude, and that's a
yeah.
challenge to
It's
succeed.
a fair argument. He doesn't cover it in this book, but it comes down to a pathogen avoidance. So what this we can cover this in future ones, but I think it's worthwhile for us to go into this just to talk about how ridiculous the whole concept of racism really is. Because there was a cataclysm about 65,000 years ago. They're unsure what the causal factor was of the cataclysm. The dominant hypothesis right now is something called the eruption of a volcanic island that plunged us into an ice age, killing off the majority of all human beings. We went down to approximately 7,000 human beings. So only living in East Africa. And then 2,000 of the 7,000 left East Africa and became every other ethnicity on planet Earth. So my wife got me 23andMe for Christmas one year. I'm like, well, how far back are they going? Because if it was me, I'd take you $75 and send everyone the same picture of the same single-celled organism, because we all evolved from that one organism. So the concept of racism is ridiculous from that perspective, except when you look at it through the lens of pathogen avoidance. See, what happens is science is a relatively new discovery. It was actually, believe it or not, according to Yuval Noah Harari, he says that science is actually the discovery of our own ignorance. So, and that's only about 200 to 400 years old. So, what ends up happening is that if you look at pathogen density, right, so this comes from naturalists, that the majority of all life on planet Earth hovers around the sea level. So 90% of all species exist between a mile below and a mile above. It's the combination of the sea and sunlight that kind of creates life, call it. Now, if you take that same analysis and you do it over the equator, the majority of all life is right around the equator for the majority of our evolution. That includes pathogens. So if you and I look different, and we look a little different, so you just kind of sound a little funny,
Yeah,
especially when you
I'm
root for the
I'm
Miami
much
Dolphins.
more I'm much
Yeah.
more handsome than you are.
All right. So, but let's say we were trading. Our tribes were trading. We weren't going to try to kill each other. We had something that you didn't have, vice versa. So we had to trade for it. And that was very common in our ancestral past. We would shake hands because the right hand was the weapon holder. I'd shake your hand, showing I don't have a weapon. You would meet that in some type of fellowship. We'd exchange the goods. I'd bring your germs now back to my tribe, and you do the same for yours. And if I did that where half my tribe died, now I'm thinking bad things about you because I don't know pathogens exist. It's bad juju. It says something wrong with you. Those dirty people over there, that type of thing. And all you have to do is track uh, um, Captain Captain Cook's voyages in the Pacific. Every island that he landed on, within a year, 90% of the indigenous population died
Yeah,
because of
but that
smallpox or
also that
influenza.
also happened in the United States. I don't know if it was 90%, but
I
when
think
you
it's
started having
95%.
you had Western European settlers coming to the United States, when what would be the United States, and they were Native Americans. This is part of what took place. So yeah, it did happen for Captain Cook as well. But and by the way, what you're saying right now, I agree with 1,000%. But it may get you canceled by somebody
Yeah.
because
Well,
it,
bear in mind, I'm not excusing racism. I'm
yeah,
saying what is
no,
the evolutionary origin of it? Just like,
correct,
we evolved to be certain ways that are not legal. So it's like, no, what we need to do is recognize it's part of our programming. So part of it is if you lower the definition of racism low enough, you will catch every single human being, because we are all naturally leery of people that don't look the same as us. But it's
correct.
not it's not uncoverable, or unrecoverable. In fact, one of the studies he outlines from Yale is young children that are pre-language are more likely to accept a toy from someone that speaks the same language as their parents. So
Hmm.
it's and they tried it with every ethnicity on planet Earth. The child will still more likely take the toy or interact with the person that speaks the same language as a parent, regardless of ethnicity. So
But
that
would
this
you say would you say now in U.S. politics, okay, and I certainly don't think we're a post-racial society. I would not say that. But would you say that folks are less concerned, okay, less concerned with race and ethnicity, and more concerned with, again, being in their in group, their ideological perspective, their allegiance to a certain party or politician? Would you say, again, I'm not saying we're post racial. That's not what I am saying. It is very much alive and exists. I get that. But would you say that the allegiances are changing? And would you say that um, maybe that's a sign of some progress in which we're kind of bridging that gap?
Oh no, I can tell you study after study after study that actually shows um, um, significantly less racism today than ever before. Like one was
Yeah.
done by Seth Stevens Davidowitz in Everybody Lies, and again he followed it up in Don't Trust Your Gut. What he was able to do is to actually study using Google metadata
Hmm.
how infrequent racist jokes are researched compared to previous years. So it is socially unacceptable. Like, do you remember when there was Polish jokes when we were we were
Yes.
kids,
Well, I'm
right? So
also from South Florida, so we used other others instead of
other
Polish.
ethnicities.
Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
got to tell you, I'm Irish, and most of the Irish jokes are really funny.
Yeah.
Like an Irish guy walks out of a bar. It could happen.
It
It's a
could
funny
happen.
joke.
Hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've heard that one.
Yeah, yeah. And the so picture but the searching for jokes like that has been steadily decreasing since they were able to actually track this stuff back to 2002 or so. So it's become socially unacceptable to tell racist jokes like that. Perfect example is the Polish jokes I was mentioning before switched in my lifetime to blonde jokes. So the and that's someone that you're can't tell what ethnicity they are necessarily. So the idea there is the world is getting more tolerant. It is getting better. It's just what happens is, and this I'll take your industry out to task for this. The press doesn't focus on that. Like our audiences are the safest, healthiest, wealthiest human beings ever to walk the earth. Yet they
Yeah,
wouldn't know it if they watched the news. And here's the dilemma with the news: studying a culture through its news is like studying a culture through its sewer system. It's not really indicative of the whole of what's really going on. And that's one of the complaints the scientists make, but it's for a reason. It's not the media's fault. You got to grab eyeballs. What's the best way to grab eyeballs?
yeah,
Tell people
and
that,
that's something that, look, tonight I'm going on, because it's we're filming this during the New Hampshire primary, so folks
yeah,
in the Republican Party are going out to vote for their presidential preference. But what's interesting is tonight I'll go on and I will provide analysis of, for example, how this differs between Iowa and New Hampshire, and to an English speaking audience made up of folks who were more than likely born in this country, maybe moved from New Hampshire or from that part of the country. That part of it is not as relevant, right? And there are very distinct differences between a caucus and a primary, and the histories behind the voting patterns in those two states. But that is what the Spanish language audience will need more than anything, because many of them, I'm not going to say most, or a little bit less than half, I don't know, but many of them have never, this may be their first United States presidential election,
wow,
because they may have just arrived in the United States within the last 2 or 3 years. Some of the estimates have it close to between 400,000 and 500,000 Cubans who have entered the United States over the last 5 years. So
wow,
there, and many of them, I would venture to say most, are in South Florida and could be watching my kind of newscast. So why is
cool
that
stuff.
important? It's different audiences, right?
Yeah,
But what I always encourage everyone to look at in the newsroom is, I understand what gets clicks, because nowadays you can't even measure just based off of Nielsen. You have to look at the, who's watching your fast channels, et cetera, et cetera. It's very different, but not everything is bad news.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
There is good news out there,
Well, that's what I want this podcast to be. I want it to be like a crucible of truth in a sea of chaos. So it's how can you and I break down these things? So I got a couple questions for you that you're uniquely qualified to answer. All right. So I've been told that the people coming to the United States from, especially from Latin America, we'll call it, they actually vote conservative more often than not. Is that the case?
So what's been happening, and there aren't definitive studies yet, but what has been happening is a good amount, if not the majority, of the migration into the United States of Hispanic or Latino background have been from Cuba, uh, Venezuela, Colombia to a certain extent, but also Nicaragua. And three of the four of those countries have, either in the case of Cuba, you've been under a communist dictatorship. Venezuela, they have their own version of socialism. They call it 21st century socialism, which has produced inflation at like 400% or something like
Wow.
that. And you've
Damn.
had mass migration between just those two countries in collectively over the last 20 years into the millions at this point. And of course, Nicaragua has a dictatorship as well, although they dress it up a little bit differently through some sham elections. And when they come here, I think, and this drives me crazy, the majority of them that settle in Florida, uh, they tend, I don't want to say they are rock solid Republicans like the Cuban Americans are. Cuban Americans, there's been this myth that has been pushed by the Democratic Party for years. We are going to get some of them. Yeah, I mean, you got three out of four are voting for Republicans. One out of four may vote for you. But you're seeing this push by the Republican Party, specifically of Florida, because remember,
Hmm.
every state has their own political parties. Yes, they're Republican, they're Democrat, and others, but the Republican Party of Florida, someone said, is the Alabama football team of politics, the college football equivalent, right? They are very good. They are very organized. They register these voters and they persuade you to come because they basically say, through different messaging, the Democrats are in favor of the types of governments that you fled. Okay, I'm making it
Mhm.
very simple, but that's
Yeah.
along the lines, right? And a major part of that shift came in 2020 when Senator Bernie Sanders was running competitively with now President Joe Biden, and he proudly labeled himself a democratic socialist. Now, um, Senator Sanders might be a very nice man. I don't know him personally. I've never met him. I've met the president. I've met former President Obama and others. But Senator Bernie Sanders and his movement did a hell of a lot of damage to Florida Democrats and immigrants who came in who after becoming citizens, which is a process in and of itself, but after becoming citizens and capable of casting a ballot in the United States, they equated the Democrat socialist to, you guys are socialists. I fled a socialist country. And why would I sign up with you? So the majority of what's coming, at least into Florida, I'm not going to say the rest of the country, because what we've seen is the rest of the country still continue. If you're talking about the Latino population, they still lean towards the Democratic Party. They still do, but the Republicans have made inroads. And in Florida is a big part of why they've made those inroads with them. And I understand Senator Sanders and folks that supported him. They want to give you a 10-slide PowerPoint presentation on the origins of what a democratic socialist is, and they use Scandinavian countries as examples. And I always say, no one has time for that. That's not what they're into. They hear socialist as part of what you label yourself as, and they're going to turn off to you, to your movement, and anyone that's around you, they're going to label you, even though if you just see the makeup of the United States Senate, the vast majority, if not almost every single one of the Democratic senators, do not in any way identify with democratic socialism. There are some that are more left of center than others, but they don't identify. As a matter of fact, Bernie Sanders ran as a Democrat for president. Bernie Sanders is technically a registered independent who caucuses with Democrats and mostly votes with Democrats. But
Hmm.
it's been he and that movement and their inclusion of socialism has been very, very damaging, particularly in Florida if you're a Democrat, and has led to widespread support for the Republican Party.
Wow. And do you have any information on how they vote? Do they vote their own ethnicity? Because I've
No,
noticed that in certain areas of the country, it's like when you see like a heavy population of Asians or Arabs or what have you, they'll vote someone in to a high
it,
position.
I would say the only ones that are lock solid majority for one party in Florida, at least, are Cuban Americans are solidly Republican. And what was interesting is you see this shift, and you could study if you're a real nerd like I am when it comes to politics. You study the precinct data, and you look
Hmm.
precinct by precinct in specific counties. I, of course, live in Broward County, which is the most Democratic county in Florida. Miami-Dade used to be number two. Very interesting. Notice
Hmm.
that in Miami-Dade County in 2016, Hillary Clinton won that county. She lost Florida, but she won Miami-Dade County by 30 points.
Wow.
4 years later, 4 years later, not 40, just four, Joe Biden wins Miami-Dade County by 7.
Ooh.
There's a 23-point swing. And then you look at the precincts, it's not necessarily that Cuban Americans in Hialeah, an overwhelmingly Cuban American enclave just outside of Miami, um, all of a sudden became Democrats 4 years earlier. No, many of them just stayed home because they didn't like Trump. But once they fell in with his message and truly believed what it was that he was selling them, including a lot of his tightening of not necessarily the embargo, but economic sanctions and immigration matters with the dictatorship over there, it was incredibly eye-opening to see how they then came back out and voted. And you saw that shift from a 30-point victory to just a 7-point victory. And then 2 years later, although there are some other factors, but Ron DeSantis won Miami-Dade County. It's not the same election. It's not presidential. It's a gubernatorial. But he won Miami-Dade County. And in Florida, there's usually only 7 to 9 counties that are blue, but solidly they always look at Southeast Florida, Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, going straight down, are usually solidly blue. And you've seen the shift mainly, I think, because of Hispanic voters coming out for the Republicans.
Wow. Interesting stuff. Well, what I think we should do is wrap this one up just with a little recommendation here. This is the best book I've ever read. I highly recommend it. It's a foundational way that you can understand the world better by understanding how we got here. What are the origins of the human mind? So I can't wait to interview Steven Pinker. This is one of the things I'm looking forward to once we get enough subscribership. So be sure to subscribe. Thanks again for watching.